Under the previous order, the Senate having received from the House a message with respect to H.R. 2112, the Senate insists on its amendments, agrees to a conference with the House, and the Chair appoints the following as conferees on the part of the Senate.
Senators Cole, Harkin, Feinstein, Johnson of South Dakota, Nelson, Nebraska, Pryor, Brown of Ohio, Inouye, Murray, Mikulski, Blunt, Cochran, McConnell, Collins, Moran, Hoeven, Hutcherson, and Shelby.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nominations: the Judiciary. Scott Wesley Skobdal of Wyoming to be United States District Judge. Richard G. Andrews of Delaware to be United States District Judge.
2 minutes equally divided.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Madam President, I want to ask for your wholehearted support for Judge Skobdal of Wyoming. He was nominated by our Democratic governor. He was appointed by the President, and he has the wholehearted support of our delegation. We have spoken for him in committee and are doing that again on the floor, and we have a full statement that we submitted. So I would thank you for your vote on this. He came up through the courts in Wyoming and now will be a federal judge with your help. Thank you.
Who yields? Who yields back time? Time is yielded back. Under previous order, the Andrews nomination is confirmed. The question is on the Skobdal nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio.
There you go.
Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoban. Mrs. Hutcherson. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Noway. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Yes. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray.
Little face on it.
Mr. Nelson, Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative. Akaka, Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Beckidge, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Dement, Enzi, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Hoven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Carey, Kirk, Klobuchar, Cole, Kyle, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson, Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Paul, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Snow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Aye.
there any senators who wish to vote or to change their vote? Okay. Any senators who wish to vote or to change their vote? Not on this vote. The yeas are 96, the nays are 0. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid upon the table. The President shall be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session. The Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Madam President, I ask consent the Senate being as in morning session with senators permitted to speak up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. Ask unanimous consent that I be considered as if in morning business.
The Senate is in morning business, Senator, and the Senator is recognized.
Madam President, after the vote today, I think that any effort to pass a bill such as the ones that we just now voted on would be very difficult, but something good does happen from that, and that is that we had the vast majority of people in this chamber recognizing that we need to do something that would be stimulative to the economy, something like, or I should say something unlike the stimulus bill that we had before, where only 3% of the money actually went to building roads, highways, maintenance, and that type of thing. So I do appreciate the fact that we are now in a position where I think with this behind us, we can be looking at a good, legitimate highway and transportation reauthorization bill. I've been working very closely with Senators Boxer, Vitter, and Baucus. We are considered the big four in the Environment and Public Works Committee to come up with something. And I have to say that we have worked very hard. And I'm talking about hours and hours. Anytime you can get Senator Barbara Boxer from California and me to agree on something, you know that we've gone to a lot of work. And we have. And we've done a lot of giving and a lot of taking. But Senator Boxer and I, along with Senators Vicker and Baucus, recognize that we desperately need to have a transportation reauthorization bill and to do it the right way. All these things that we've been doing with extensions, they don't work. There's not a member of this chamber that doesn't go back every week and talk to his transportation director and they say, why can't we quit these extensions and go ahead and get a good bill? Well, we have a good bill we're working on. We're talking about reforms. It's our intention, I believe, next week to mark this bill up. So we are looking forward to it. And I have a very strong bias toward the transportation. For the years I was in the House, I was on that committee. Back then, we didn't have any problems because back then we had a highway trust fund that always had a surplus. And it had a surplus because we were very aggressive at that time. And, of course, at that time, a lot more people were purchasing gas. The revenues were up. And so we had a surplus. Unfortunately, and this always happens in Washington, D.C., as people came along and members looked at this surplus, that was a target. Everybody went in on it, so they put their deal into the Highway Trust Fund. Well, that's partly where we got where we are today. Now, I do appreciate the conversation we get from President Obama. He's always talking about how he wants infrastructure, and he had the picture where he was standing in front of the bridge and making a speech about creating jobs, and then he doesn't have anything in his program that does anything with infrastructure. And our problem is that President Obama has been talking the talk. And he's spoken about more infrastructure, I think, than any president since President Eisenhower proposed the interstate system. But then when you get up to the $800 billion stimulus bill, in doing the calculations, only 3%, about $27 billion of that was in highway construction or maintenance. And we made an effort on the floor, a bipartisan effort. Senator Boxer and I did, to try to raise the percentage up to, I wanted it up to about 10% or maybe even higher, however much that we could get the work done at that time. We were unable to do it. So the President was not on our side on that. So anyway, I think the good news is that today's votes, both the Democrats and Republicans, it showed that they are very interested and very supportive of a highway bill. So I think now we've gotten a lot of that stuff out of the way. We can go in and concentrate on a highway bill. I think both parties are trying to create jobs and economic growth through the building of highways and bridges, and most Americans are unaware of just how damaging regulations are. When you stop and think about proposing a massive program, which is what we're talking about now, a reauthorization program, it isn't massive in that the funding level would probably stay at the same that it's been since the Highway Reauthorization Bill of 2005. But when they talk about that, we are always faced with the regulation problem. We're trying to address the regulation problems that are out there in this bill to try to have some shortcuts, try to get some things done that otherwise would take a lot longer. But regulations have been just a huge problem, and this administration's Environmental Protection Agency alone has just an unprecedented number of regulations, and they're destroying jobs, and I think the results are there. I'll mention the 5 most expensive regulations of all the regulations that have come out. First would be the greenhouse gas regulations. I think we all know what that is. That's the regulations of trying to do something that through regulations that they were unable to do through legislation. Secondly, ozone, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. That would be about a $678 billion loss in GDP by 2020. Incidentally, I failed to mention the greenhouse gas regulations. They would be in excess of $300 to $400 billion a year. The Boiler MAC regulations, that would be $1 billion to the loss to the GDP. Utility MAC, MAC is the maximum achievable technology. In other words, one of the problems with all these MAC bills that are coming out of the administration is that there is no technology available to carry out the mandates on emissions. Cement MAC, that's another one. That would be $3.5 billion in compliance costs. Fortunately, in September, President Obama withdrew the EPA's proposed ozone standards. There's a good reason for this. For one reason, the ozone standards are supposed to be predicated on new science. This is on the same science that the last ozone changes were based on. And I think when people caught on to that and they recognized what it would cost, I know in my state of Oklahoma, we'd be looking at some 15 counties that would be out of attainment. And there's nothing more dreadful that can happen to a state than to have your counties go out of attainment so that you're not able to recruit jobs or even keep the jobs that you have. So we'd be talking about, in that case, it would have been around 7 million jobs throughout the United States. Well, because of that, politically, he has postponed that. Quite frankly, I think he's postponing it until after the next election. And if he should be reelected, I can assure you we're going to see that again. Now, the Democrats are always saying that we need to have tax increases, and that's the best way to grow. And I look at this sometimes. Recently, the Office of Management and Budget came up with a calculation that is consistent with one that I've been using for 20 years. That is, for each 1% increase in economic activity in this country, or 1% growth, that equates to about $50 billion of new revenue. And interestingly enough, this is not all a Republican idea. It was President Kennedy, the last time I checked, he was a Democrat. He's the one, and this is a direct quote, he said, "We've got to raise more money for the Great Society, and the best way to raise money is to reduce marginal tax rates." And he did it, and it worked. And we saw what Ronald Reagan did in the years that followed that. And during the 8 years that he was in office, the proceeds from marginal rates went up from $244 billion to $466 billion. And that was in a time when rates were reduced more than in any other 8-year period in history. So I think we're looking at other opportunities by reducing some of the regulations and all that we can come up with and resolve the problem. I think one thing that is very important, and I know there's no one in this chamber that doesn't recognize my concern that I've expressed over the years over the legislation that has been proposed ever since the Kyoto Treaty on legislative cap and trade. Cap and trade, every time there is an analysis made, whether it's made by MIT, whether it's made by the Wharton School, the WIFA it's called, the Charles Rivers, or any of the rest of them, the range of the cost of cap and trade legislatively is always between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now we find out that if you do it by regulation, it's going to be far more than that. And these are Democrats who are on record as saying that. I think Lisa Jackson, she's one I have, by the way, I have a great deal of respect for her. Lisa Jackson, the Obama-appointed director of the Environmental Protection Agency. Every time I ask her a question, she gives me an honest answer. And she said, I have said over and over again, I'm quoting now, Lisa Jackson, she said, as the president, as I've said over and over again, as has the president, that we do understand that there are costs to the economy of addressing global warming emissions, and the best way to address them is through a gradual vote to a market-based program like cap and trade. But what she's saying here is that cap and trade bills, yes, they would cost a lot of money. No one refutes the $300 to $400 billion figure, but this would be even more than that. I think John Kerry said the same thing. He said if Congress does not pass legislation dealing with climate change, the administration will use the Environmental Protection Agency to impose new regulations. These regulations would be more expensive. And I think that the EPA has admitted that if they were able to accomplish this, if they were, through regulations, they would need to hire an additional 230,000 employees to spend an additional $21 billion to implement its greenhouse gas regime. And all of this economic pain is for no gain. As the EPA Administrator Jackson also admitted before the EPA committee, these regulations will have no effect on the climate. So I do want to mention that. I think that's significant. There are a lot of people who disagree with me in terms of the impact of CO2 emissions and all that.
Senator, there's a 10-minute limit.
No, I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized as if in morning business without a time restriction.
We were already in the morning business with the 10-minute limit, but if you want to ask for an extension.
Let me have an extension, please.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Is there objection?
No objection.
Okay. Without objection, so ordered.
All right, I'll hurry through this thing.
Okay.
Let me just say this, that two things having to do with that issue I think are very important. One is that if we were to pass legislation, or if we were to do something through regulations that would be aimed at reducing greenhouse gases, would this have an effect on the reduction of emissions worldwide? And I asked the question to Lisa Jackson. Her answer was no. Obviously, the problem is not here in the United States. It's in China, India, and other places. And so in looking at it that way, I have to also mention that we all know what happened with ClimateGate. We all know that when we went in and started an endangerment finding, that it was based on the science that came from the IPCC, which has been totally discredited. And when I have longer, I will go into the details as to how that was discredited. For example, the Daily Telegraph said it was such a great scandal, it could well be the greatest scandal in modern science. And so that was what was happening. They were cooking the science at the United Nations and the IPCC. Now we are going to the point where we had asked for an Inspector General's opinion as to whether or not the EPA had followed the proper guidelines in trying to regulate greenhouse gases, and in fact they did not follow the right guidelines. So I would only say that the Inspector General's investigation uncovered that the EPA failed to engage in the required record-keeping process leading up to the endangerment finding decision, and it also did not follow its own peer review procedures to ensure that the science behind the decision was sound science. So the EPA Administrator, Lisa Jackson, readily admitted that it would not, that the science that was used was this science called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I would just say this, Madam President, that we are concerned about what is going to happen now. We're concerned about the over-regulations. We're concerned about the process that's been used and how regulations are used to create an agenda, to support an agenda that the President has. I'll mention one last thing. One last thing, and that is a regulation that I didn't mention before. Of the 5 most expensive regulations, this isn't one of them, but it could end up being the most. We know for a fact the United States of America, we have a report now that shows, with all of the findings, with all the good things that are happening in the shale throughout the United States and elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, that we could be totally free from dependency on any other country if we would just get politicians out of the way and develop our own resources. We have enough natural gas to meet Americans' demand for 90 years, enough oil for 50 years, and but in order to do this, they have to use a process called hydraulic fracturing. Ironically, that was started in my state of Oklahoma in 1949. And it's been used ever since that time. And there's never been a confirmed case of groundwater contamination. Nonetheless, right now we see that they are going through this process of saying that we are going to take over the regulation of hydraulic fracturing from the states and put it in the federal government. I have to be suspicious that there's motive behind that, and that motive is to try to restrict the use of hydraulic fracturing. Now, you could open up the East Coast, the West Coast, the Gulf Coast, the Northern Slope, and everything else. If you can't use that process, we're not going to be able to achieve energy independence, which we can do. We don't have to use anything new that's out there other than oil, gas, and coal. And this is, and with what's happening right now with hydrogen, we have an opportunity to become self-sufficient. So with that, I will yield the floor so my good friend will make his comments.
Madam President.
The senator from Idaho is recognized.
Madam President, I rise today to recognize the valor and accomplishments of the 389th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron. The 389th, better known as the T-Bolts, is part of the 366th Fighter Wing based at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho. At Mountain Home, the squadron is composed of 80 airmen from across the United States, including aviators and essential ground personnel. While deployed, the squadron grew to over 400, including maintainers, intelligence personnel, and support staff from the 366th. In May 2011, the T-Bolts deployed to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan with 18 F-15E Strike Eagles to support Operation Enduring Freedom. In the process, they demonstrated resolve and what can be accomplished through fierce loyalty to each other and to our country. The T-Bolts prosecuted 3,100 combat missions and dropped 800 tons of ordnance. They supported 3,700 ground missions by American and allied forces and responded to 820 troops in contact emergency support combat calls. In addition, they worked directly with Special Operations Forces to destroy 170 enemy weapons caches and capture 620 detainees, including 90 high-value individuals. The diligence of the maintainers and ground personnel ensured that the 389th met 100% of their taskings without missing a single sortie. The pilots and weapon systems officers broke the F-15E deployment record, flying more than 14,000 hours in just over 6 months. Through their excellence and determination, the 389th kept relentless pressure on the al-Qaeda network, killing key members of their senior leadership. Additionally, they directly supported numerous large-scale coalition ground operations with kinetic and non-kinetic effects as they provided lethal, close air support across Afghanistan. The men and women of the 389th made a real and substantial contribution to the safety of America, the success of the global war on terror, and substantial damage to al-Qaeda and those who would do us harm. By successfully taking the fight to the enemy, the T-Bolts helped write the history of the early 21st century through their tenacity and their courage. No one summed it up better or more eloquently than the commander of the 366th Fighter Wing, Colonel Ron Buckley, who said of his airmen, quote, "I am incredibly proud of the professionalism and dedication our gunfighters displayed while flawlessly executing their mission to deliver precise combat air power for joint operations on the ground." From air crews to maintainers to support, the T-boats carried on the incredible legacy of the gunfighters and answered our nation's call, end quote. I also want to, importantly, take this opportunity to honor America's unsung heroes by recognizing and commending the families and loved ones of those who serve in the 389th. We're also proud of their service and their commitment and their immense sacrifices they made and continue to make on behalf of our country. The T-boats served honorably in the defense of a grateful nation, and I am pleased today to recognize the heroic members of the 389th for their valorous service while deployed in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. I'm reminded of the core values of the Air Force: integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all you do. There is no better example than the airmen of the 389th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron. With consummate bravery and boldness, the T-boats honor every American through a spirit of dedication and a sense of duty to defend a cause larger than oneself. For their efforts, we and future generations are forever indebted and eternally grateful. Thank you very much, Madam President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
The senator from Oklahoma is recognized.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call in process.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, I apologize to the chair. I had a misunderstanding of where we were, and I only wanted to try to get the point across, which I think I failed to do, that the cost of these regulations, and I think that I use as the example of the 5, and I've mentioned actually 6 when you consider hydraulic fracturing also as one of the regulations, that by far the one that is the most expensive is the regulation that is the regulations that would be for the greenhouse gases. And I think since we have pretty much established the cost of what it would cost to do a cap-and-trade bill with legislation, and the range being from $300 to $400 billion. And then the quotes that I used, which I won't repeat now, from Director Jackson and Senator Kerry and others, that doing it through regulation would be far more expensive. I think that it's we need to be looking at it in terms of about $400 billion a year. This is a tax on the American people. This is the cost to our GDP. And it's something I remember back in 1993 when we had the Clinton-Gore tax increase. It was the largest one in 4 decades at that time. It was an increase in the death tax, an increase in marginal rates, an increase in capital gains, an increase in almost all taxes. And it was a $30 billion tax increase. Now, what we're talking about here is a tax increase that is 10 times that great, 10 times. We're using the figure now of $400 billion because we know that through regulation it's going to cost more. Now, again, and I go back and I was to repeat the quote that we had from Director Jackson of the EPA, who said in response to my question live in our committee, I said, you know, if we were to pass, at that time I think it was the Waxman-Markey bill, it doesn't really matter, cap and trade is cap and trade. So if we're going to pass that, would that reduce overall emissions? And she said no, because that would only apply to the United States. And I would carry it one step further. If we were to pass anything or do anything through regulation here, all it's going to do is take our manufacturing base to go out and try to find the energy necessary to operate. And where do they go? They go to places like China, like India, like Mexico, places that have almost no emission standards. So if there's a pollution problem, it becomes much greater and not less in terms of overall emissions. Then the second thing that I would often have quoted Administrator Jackson was right before the Copenhagen United Nations event, where they're going to try to get to convince the rest of the world that we're going to pass legislation that would be cap and trade and impose this tax on the American people. Right before I left for Copenhagen, I said in a committee hearing to Administrator Jackson, I said, I have a feeling that as soon as I leave town, you're going to have an endangerment finding. And sure enough, that's what happened. But I said, now, when you have an endangerment finding, it has to be based on science. What science would you be using? She said, by and large, it would be the science developed by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, and since that, as ironically, right after that, the ClimateGate came up and really destroyed the legitimacy of the IPCC. And I've read some of the quotes that were given by different people when they talked about ClimateGate. A British writer, George Monbiot, known for his environmental and political activism. Now, he's on the other side of this thing. He writes a weekly column for The Guardian. He said, quote, pretending that it isn't a real crisis isn't going to make it go away. Now, here he's referring to ClimateGate, and that is the fact that they were cooking the science. Nor is an attempt to justify the emails and technicalities. Again, talking about the participants in IPCC. We'll be able to get past this only by grasping reality, apologizing where appropriate, and demonstrating that it cannot happen again. Again, I mentioned the Daily Telegraph in the UK. This scandal could well be the greatest in modern history, modern science. And then the Atlantic magazine, who generally is editorializing on the other side of this issue, said, quote, the closed-mindedness of these supposed men of science, their willingness to go to any lengths to defend a preconceived message is surprising even to me. The stink of intellectual corruption is overpowering. Now, that was the loss of credibility of the whole idea of the science that was put together by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations. But to make it even worse, we requested that the IG, the Inspector General, do a study and report back as to the science and how the science was developed by the IPCC and whether or not it followed the guidelines that were necessary. And they came back just a week ago with a report that says the EPA has failed to follow the responsible guidelines. In fact, even before the scope of the study was finalized today, the EPA was already collecting data samples at the undisclosed fracking sites. So they're going in now to using the same type of flawed science and going after other parts of their agenda. In this case, it would be hydraulic fracturing, which I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is an attempt to stop our ability to develop our own resources. So in the course of this overregulation, I think that we have to keep in mind and keep talking about the 6 greatest and the most costly regulatory problems that we have out there and how much it's going to cost the American people. And again, the one that is the most serious right now is trying to regulate and do a cap and trade through regulations as opposed to doing it through legislation. So we're going to keep talking about that, Madam President. It's not going to go away. People think, time will make people forget, but you don't forget something of that magnitude. I did a calculation in my state of Oklahoma, as I always do. I get the number of families that file a tax return each year. And when something comes along that's going to cost something, I do the calculation, I do the math, and I go back to the American people and say, get ready, this is what it's going to cost you. If we were to have passed any of the bills that were like the Kyoto Protocol, and the last one being the Waxman-Markey bill, the cost would have been at least $300 billion. If you take that annual cost, that would cost my tax-paying families in Oklahoma in excess of $3,000 a family, and you get nothing for it. So we can do an awful lot of talking about the deficits and the spending of this administration. Let's don't overlook perhaps the most expensive thing for the American people, and that is overregulation that makes us non-competitive with the rest of the world. And with that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to pay tribute to John Hardiman, the public defender for the state of Rhode Island, who passed away several days ago. John was, frankly, the finest public servant I have ever seen in my entire career. As a soldier, as an elected official, I have never encountered anyone with the dedication, the decency, and the determination of John Hardiman. He literally devoted his life to the Office of Public Defender in the state of Rhode Island. He graduated from law school in 1982. He started as a staff attorney there, worked his way up to the head of the trial division, then became the public defender for the entire state of Rhode Island. His life was devoted to the law. Quietly, persistently, with diligence, dedication, and decency, he sought to do justice. Indeed, justice not for the powerful or privileged, but for the powerless. Indeed, in many cases, his clients were not only notorious, they were infamous. But John knew that the test of our ideals, the test of our legal system, of our constitutional form of government was that the laws would not simply protect the powerful and privileged, but they protect all Americans. Above the entrance to the United States Supreme Court are the words, equal justice under law. For many people, even lawyers, those are just words. For John Hardiman, it was his life's vocation. And he made real those words in the life of every Rhode Islander. John was a tenacious advocate, but he was always a remarkably modest and decent man. His legal skills rested on a foundation of unimpeachable integrity and decency. He dedicated his life to serving others. In that advocation and vocation, he was following the example of his father, Dr. James Hardiman, and his mother. They left John a shining example of compassion and concern, a generous spirit, and a humble heart. And all of his brothers and sisters followed that same example as they, too, in their lives, served others. Now, I had the privilege of growing up with John. He was one of the little kids in school, about 5 years younger, but he always had the reputation entirely justified of being a good kid. And where I come from, being a good kid was the highest form of praise. And that good kid turned out to be an extraordinary man, advocate, public servant. And this is a poignant moment for me because I recall the many times I saw him throughout his life and my life. As a young student in grammar school, as an athlete like his brothers, as a lawyer, as a public defender, as a public servant. He was someone who you were always glad to see. And those types of individuals are rare and precious indeed. Now, John's passing diminishes all of us, especially his family. But his life has touched the lives of every Rhode Island. Many will never recognize what he has done, but by standing up for justice and for the rule of law and for the rights of those who are in the shadows, he stood up for all of us, nobly, decently, with a proud spirit, but a gentle spirit also. Now, we've all been diminished, but what he's done for us has made us stronger and better and more ready to go on. to take up his work. And his example will sustain us and inspire us as we go forward, as we try to finish his noble work. Now, I want to especially extend my condolences to his children, Elizabeth and Emmett, and to all his family. Rhode Island has lost an extraordinary public servant, an extraordinary gentleman. But we are better for having known him. We're better for having him served us so well, so courageously, so decently. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
I would not note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.